Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce you to Dr. Muna Saleh. I've been following her for a minute now, and the volunteers can tell you how excited we've been to hear her speak. She's so much experience as an educator and an advocate on the topic of like rethinking our curriculum with the guidance of folks of color and how to strengthen our communities. So I'm so excited to welcome her to speak with us. Dr. Saleh, just a heads up, we're also live streaming. So there'll be folks who have questions in the chat, but there's also folks watching you from YouTube. Yeah, just feel free to take the stage. I'm so excited to have you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to be sharing my screen. So you let me know, please, if it doesn't share properly. And I would like, okay, and then can you see it in presentation mode, like the way that I was hoping that
it is?
Oh.
Yep, it's perfect. Looks
Okay,
great.
perfect.
Thank you
so much. Okay, well, hello, everyone. I know that you've had a very busy couple of days now, and I am so honored to be invited here. And so to begin, I would like to begin with a dua, which is a form of prayer and invocation, as I always begin my presentations. So, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And I also would like to honor and acknowledge that I'm currently in Treaty 6 territory, a home place for many Indigenous nations and communities, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux peoples. As a daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees, I intimately know the intergenerational reverberations of settler colonial violence and injustice in my family. And I'm committed to my responsibilities as a settler on these lands, as a treaty person, and as an educator for justice. So thank you, Tara, Abigail, and all the organizers for inviting me to be here with you all today. What a wonderful conference. It's a conference I wish I had as a youth, and I wish that all racialized youth could have had in the past and hopefully have the opportunity to attend in the future. And so I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit more of my own stories. So I'm a narrative inquirer, which means that my research is story-based. And today I'm going to be sharing stories and insights from my life and my research. Stories that taught me about growing into adolescence and womanhood, and about what Maxine Greene discussed as the need to free, quote, free the imagination, end quote. For as Ben Okri said in his wonderful book, A Way to Be Free, quote, one way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early or along the way, or we are also living the stories we planted, knowingly or unknowingly, in ourselves. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives, end quote. This quote has resonated with me, and I actually built my entire dissertation around it. I played with that metaphor of rooting, growing. And as I'm sharing some of these stories with you, I'd like to invite you to think about what are the stories that have been planted in you, either unknowingly or knowingly. And I want you to be thinking about that, because towards the end, I'm going to actually revisit that question. So a huge part of my stories is growing up in a working class family with immigrant parents who themselves grew up as Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And you see on the right side there, that's an image of us growing up in my childhood home. And then there's the towards the bottom right-hand corner, that's my Siti, my grandmother. And she is someone who really, she was a Palestinian refugee. She escaped when she was pregnant with my father in 1948 from her small village in Palestine. And so she taught me about how important it is to be a radical truth teller, Allah yarhama. She actually lived with a bullet in her back for the rest of her life since that fateful day. And yet somehow was the most joyous and hopeful person I've ever met. And in a recent paper, I refer to her teachings as her quote unquote curriculum of Rahma. In naming her teachings as a form of curriculum, I drew upon the idea by my good friend and curriculum theorist, Janice Huber, and her colleagues Sean Murphy and Jean Clendenin, that classrooms and schools aren't the only places where curriculum is being composed. And that's the key word there. It's composed. They're not just some external documents that are sent down the pipeline and that are enacted by robots and taken up by other robots. Curriculum is actually lived. It is composed in that dynamic relationship. So, but this idea that curriculum is also composed in familial places. And when I'm talking about familial places, it's the expanded understanding of family, including chosen family and family, in your community places. And so I think I intrinsically knew that much of my learning occurred in these places, in familial and community landscapes. But these curriculum scholars helped to give me a language and a framework that allowed me to, not even just allowed me, actually, it gave me permission. It allowed me to give myself permission to bring my Siti, Ali Irhama, and her wisdoms into my work in a much more explicit way, because they were there. I just never actually ever made that connection explicit. So in a recent paper, I delved into what I called that curriculum of Rahma that Siti composed alongside me. And I wrote, quote, "The curriculum of Rahma," and Rahma is an Arabic word that is often translated as, quote unquote, mercy, that Siti composed and lived alongside me is infinitely more complex, ethical, relational, and profound than simply signifying mercy. The root of the word Rahma is Rahim, which is womb. And so the Rahma is understood by many Arabic-speaking and or Muslim individuals and communities as being strongly related to nurturance, compassion, and love. However, in our familial curriculum making, Siti continually reminded me that love and compassion inherently dwell alongside equity and justice. So for us, living and embodying a curriculum of Rahma is an act of what Audre Lorde, and I'll speak to these thinkers and authors later, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and so many others have conceptualized as radical love, and also relational resistance against inequitable structures, processes, and practices. So the curriculum of Rahma is one that I'm constantly and continually trying to embody as an educator, scholar, friend, and especially as a mother to 3 wonderful humans, as you see in that picture at the top right, including a young autistic child. So these are the stories that live in me and that I need to constantly remind myself of in a world where I find I'm also constantly encouraged to leave out all of who I am at the door of someone else's idea of who I should be. And so I want to go back to when I was first approached about presenting at this conference. I'm just going to really stress this, that I was so in awe that a first generational Black young woman dreamed this conference up. In truth, I'm still so in awe. I remember thinking, wow, imagine how many lives this conference will shape. And imagine that it all stemmed from Abigail's dreaming for herself and other racialized youth of marginalized genders. And I made this connection between Abigail wanting to see herself and other racialized youth centered in a youth leadership conference, and my own work to have the stories and experiences of Muslim girls and women centered in my research. This desire led me to ensuring that a revised copy of my dissertation would be published as a book. Because as Rudine Sims Bishop so beautifully expressed, quote, "Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and we only have to walk through an imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror." And I really want to stress this idea that it's not just the representation. Representation is important. It's actually, when you're talking about this idea of a mirror, it is accurate representation. It is humanizing representation. Because being able to see yourself in all spaces in some way is incredibly vital and important to our own self-concept and worth and identity. And so my doctoral research was rooted in my embodied and experiential knowledge as a Canadian, Muslim, Palestinian woman, daughter, mother, educator, and researcher making a life in Treaty 6 lands in Amiskwichi, Wiskahikan. It was a 2-year multi-perspectival narrative inquiry alongside 3 Canadian Muslim mothers and their daughters as youth co-inquirers transitioned into adolescence. So I chose this time of this particular time of transition from girlhood into adolescence, because when I was first planning my doctoral research in around 2014, my eldest daughter, Malak, who you see there at the beginning of the research, and then that was taken actually just a few months ago, the more recent photo, she graduated grade 12 recently. And she was in the midst of experiencing that profound life transition. And because as I was reading some of the literature, even back in 1992, Brown and Gilligan discussed how, quote, adolescence marks a crossroads in women's development, a meeting between girl and woman, an intersection between psychological health and cultural regeneration, a watershed in women's psychology. That I want to also really stress that this is, in 1992, this is a very binary form of representing genders. We know this. But this idea that they followed hundreds of girls around at a private school, actually in the States. And what they found was that girls actually seemed to start to unknow what they knew over time. So around 9, 10, 11 years old, girls would be a lot more confident and assertive in terms of framing what their knowledge was. And then later, and they followed these girls over many years, and they started to say things like, and be more doubtful of themselves, hold themselves back, like, I don't know, maybe. And what Brown and Gilligan contended was that the girls often feel, quote, the tyranny of the nice and kind. And so, end quote. So this idea that girls are often pressured to silence themselves and their knowing to maintain relationships, including unhealthy ones. Because a true relationship requires honesty and trust and the ability to say what you honestly think without fear of being left behind. And I wondered about Malak and about how she was going to be experiencing this transition. But especially because Malak is a Muslim girl. And these stories of who a Muslim girl and a woman and, other genders is, of course, it really stayed with me, this idea of how she can experience this, because I don't think it took me a while to actually unpack and look back into my own experiences growing up here in Edmonton as a Muslim girl. And what really jolted me was this one moment when Malak and I were, I was driving Malak. She was around, I think, 11, close to 12 years old. And at the time in the city of Edmonton, there was no real rules, I guess, against hate speech in the same way that there are now. So, and I'm going to be qualifying that. There was no rules for public advertising. And so using the private advertising companies. So you could put whatever you want for the most part on a billboard, of course within limits, but some things weren't deemed, I guess, hateful enough. And so I was driving Malak, and there was this one bus that passed by us, and it had like these images of girls who were obviously Muslim because they were wearing traditional dress, including hijab. And it said something like, "Is your family oppressing you?" And it gave a number to call. And I remember Malak turning to me and asking me what it was about, and me being just so flabbergasted and upset that I couldn't answer. And so in my dissertation, I wrote, quote, "While the reverberations of 9/11 and more recent terror attacks continue to be felt, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiment and rhetoric is not a new phenomenon. However, the days, weeks, months, and years following that tragic day involved increasingly salient and disturbing narratives, misrepresenting Islam and Muslims in media and literature. For me, some of the most jarring stories have been those related to Muslim girls and women. I also wrote, quote, Muslim women, especially veiled Muslim women, are often storied in media and literature as any combination of the following: poor, uncivilized, oppressed, meek, exotic, suspicious, less than, and primitive. These narratives ignore vast personal, familial, national, linguistic, cultural, racial, political, and theological diversity within Muslim individuals and communities. And here for this image, I want to give a shout out to my fellow Muslim educator, Amina Al-Jaji. She used this image in a recently published article about her arts-informed narrative inquiry alongside her grade 9 students as they delved into a collective inquiry into the concept of single stories. And so I wish I could share her entire research project here. But in summary, Amina teaches at an Islamic school. And when she asked her students, what is the story of a Muslim? After watching Chimamanda Adichie's 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, she was shocked to discover that the words that they used to describe Muslims, and remember, this is a class of all Muslim youth, all the words were negative. And you'll see it here. I don't know if you could see my cursor, but you'll see it here in the before side here. And she was so shocked. And after discussing, she decided to ask them, okay, so what do you know about Muslims from your lived experience? And their responses were much more compassionate to themselves and their communities and loving and hopeful. And so as I discuss some of my work alongside Muslim women, youth, and their families, I wanted to have you look at these images. These are some of the counter stories that Amina students dreamed up as they continued to engage with the question, what is the story of a Muslim? Amina's work alongside her students really points to how these youth have internalized some of the dominant stories we live in and that others have of us. How, as Ben Okri talks about, these stories live and grow in us. Engaging with her research, I can't help but think about how many young people have internalized stories that are harmful to them and their families and communities. So this is a question I pose to my students and who are all pre-service teachers, meaning they're all learning to become teachers. I ask them to consider these narratives and to consider how we might be in solidarity alongside each other and our students to change these harmful stories. Because as several activists and scholars over the years have asserted, identity building isn't individual work by itself. It is inherently also collective and relational work. So the youth participants of my doctoral research really emphasize this for me. As I mentioned, several years ago, I inquired alongside other Muslim mothers and daughters as the girls were in the process of transitioning into adolescence. These youth were full of dreams. They were heavily involved in sports and theater, and they were, as we all do, navigating familial and other relationships. However, while they were all Muslim, their experiences are incredibly different. One participant, who was Lebanese, was continually navigating life and expectations from being one of very few Muslims in a small rural Alberta community, and stories of who a quote-unquote good Muslim girl is that were imposed on her from some members of her families and others. Another participant, who arrived in Canada from Afghanistan as a toddler, was navigating tension-filled relationships with other Muslim girls she had grown up with at her faith-based schools. She too was constantly needing to prove that, or feeling the need to constantly prove, that she was a quote-unquote good Muslim girl. A third participant, who was Somali, was navigating being a Black Muslim girl in hijab in many different spaces, in and out of school. At her Islamic school, she was confronted by many different types of racism, and even teachers with anti-Black racism and sentiment. And she was in larger school places. She often navigated the intersections of systems of gendered Islamophobia, sexism, and anti-Black racism. And now, in my current research alongside Muslim mothers who arrived with refugee experiences and who are caregivers to children with disabilities, I have learned that ableism and classism within and across Muslim and larger communities is really prevalent. I think about my participants' children who are now 16, 14, and 12 years old. One who has cerebral palsy and another who's hard of hearing. And the eldest who's constantly being asked to translate and bridge gaps between his parents and school and service providers. And so these are just some of the youth I've been blessed to learn from. And their experiences have taught me that they are all navigating intersecting systems of oppression, as well as social media, mental health, and dominant narratives of who they are and or quote unquote should be, while trying to build their identities alongside others. And so I know you've already discussed the concept of intersectionality from yesterday, but I'm just going to really briefly go over it and to really think about how Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw theorized this over 30 years ago. And it was rooted in how she discussed as a legal scholar how Black women in America experienced oppressive systems of sexism and anti-Black racism, and how these converge in unique ways. And so it's not additive. It's not like you're just piling things on top of each other. What Dr. Crenshaw said is that they converge, they intersect to create systems that are experienced in unique ways. And I want to stress that she stressed that it's systems that intersect. It's not identities. Because although our identities are implicated and shaped and affected by these systems, it is, yes, our identities intersect in different ways, but the concept and theory of intersectionality is really talking about the systems and how they shape our identities and how we experience the world. And so this really is a term that was coined, of course, by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, but really it builds on the work of many different scholars and activists, including one of my sheroes, Dr. Angela Davis, who's been at the forefront of racial justice movements for over 50 years. In her recent book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, Dr. Davis asserted that different struggles for justice also intersect, not just systems. She said that although gains have been made over the last decades, we're, quote, we are still faced with the challenge of understanding the complex ways race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and ability are intertwined, but also how we move beyond these categories to understand the interrelationships of ideas and processes that seem to be separate and unrelated. And she also asserted, quote, our histories never unfold in isolation. We cannot truly tell what we consider to be our own histories without knowing the other stories. And we often discover that these other stories are actually our own stories. This is the admonition, Learn Your Sister's Stories, by Black feminist sociologist Jackie Alexander. So she really brings forward this idea that we are all so interconnected and that it, quote, it is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. And so as an educator for 20 years and as a human being, my life and my thinking have been incredibly enriched by authors and women I've already mentioned, and by these three amazing Black women and radical scholars and activists. They taught me the importance of radical love and hope. Basically, the need to never give up, to keep seeking and telling the truth, and to do this alongside others. This is not easy work in education and in other systems that often ask us to conform to quote unquote common sense. And this is the way that it's always been done, ways of thinking and acting. However, as Miriame Kamba so beautifully states, quote, hope is a discipline. And that's in We Do This Till We Free Us. There have been many times I feel discouraged and that you may feel discouraged. But engaging what I now understand to be a curriculum of rahmah, of radical love and truth-telling and hope has opened up possibilities and will open up possibilities for ourselves and others to dream otherwise. And this last slide is really thinking about the need to really talk about things beyond quote unquote diversity and quote unquote inclusion. These are not bad terms, but we need to think beyond them, because this use of belonging, it doesn't really get to the heart, because it seems to individualize that struggle rather than talk about how it's systemic. So I really resonate with Dr. Bettina Love's concept of mattering. And this concept talks about how everyone matters equally in all spaces and places, and that we need to do what, as her book says, more than survive. We need to be able to thrive, and there needs to be conditions for this to happen, including in education. And she points to the lessons of the past and how, quote, abolitionists' greatest tools against injustice were their imaginations. Their imaginations fueled their resistance. Imagining being free, imagining reading, imagining marrying the love of your life, imagining your children being free, imagining life and not death, imagining seeing the world, and imagining freedom. These freedom dreams drive out apathy, and the quest for freedom becomes an internal desire necessary to preserve humanity, end quote. And she stressed the importance of co-conspirators for each other's struggles, not simply allies, co-conspirators. Because an ally, you get to choose what to support. Whereas a co-conspirator, you're there, because it is right, and you are all in because you know that your destinies are incredibly intertwined. And so I always end my presentations with this, because some of the stories although I didn't go into as much detail as I typically would, this idea that stories matter as well, and how we use them and take care of them and are driven and guided by them matter. And so it's by Barry Lopez's book, and Barry Lopez in his book, Crow and Weasel. Remember on this one thing, said Badger, the stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they're needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. That is why we put these stories in each other's memories. This is how people care for themselves. And so I invite you to really think about how we might simultaneously and collectively dream and work to build solidarities, and how we might do this in ways to care for each other and each other's stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saleh. I had chills. I loved when you were talking about like rethinking the curriculum from this perspective of radical love. And I think so many of the folks that you brought into your presentation are people whose writings have like guided me in times where I didn't know what to say or didn't know what to do or how to like work really. And I loved how you incorporated them into your presentation. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I know I learned so much. And yeah, I will also, I mean, folks, if they have questions, can also send them to me. People who are watching the recording or people who are watching the live who aren't putting it or can't put it in the chat right now. And I, can send them your way, but I know that I learned so much. All the volunteers around me are very, very thankful. And yeah, I just really appreciate you taking the time to teach us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, everyone, you're just saying thank you in the chat. I think we all feel the same way. I feel very warm.
I'm so sorry. I took up all the time. I always think I give a little bit of time, but I guess I don't.
No, it's perfect. This was perfect. I think it was good that you took your time. I learned so much, and even to revisit some of these authors was really impactful for me. So thank you. Yeah, for all of the participants who are on Remo right now, we're just going to switch to the second link that I sent you via email. You're going to have a bit of a break before we go to our next workshop. But just a huge thanks to Dr. Saleh for taking time to teach us today, and yeah, just share your experiences. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. See you all at the next